Explained by the Billy Meier contacts, mysteries, myths, legends, conspiracy theories, historical inaccuracies, and more. Compiled by David Chance, revised October 18, 2023.
Muhammad and Abdul Qasim Muhammad ibn Abd Allah. Contact Report 231.
Being circumcised does not mean immunity, but only a minimal risk of infection. Circumcision does not protect genital herpes, gonorrhea, syphilis, or other venereal diseases. However, it can be very useful where a lack of penis hygiene leads to all kinds of penile diseases, fungal infections, eczema, rot, etc. This was the order of the day in southern Arabia, especially at the time of the Prophet Muhammad, which is why he decreed the order of circumcision and the associated daily cleansing. He took over circumcision from the old Jews, who for the same reason had the same principle as a rule, tracing it back to Moses, who introduced the law of circumcision, because already then the genital impurity gave rise to enormous sexually transmitted diseases and degenerations. Shame hair was also introduced for the same reason, also for women. To my knowledge, however, these facts are no longer known, or they are deliberately concealed for whatever reason. As far as I know, the real justification was never recorded in writing, but declared to be God's demand, because the relevant laws were only followed because they were allegedly ordered by a god. Either way, however, the relevant laws have taken hold and brought physical cleanliness to the Jewish and Arab tribes and peoples, and fortunately, everything has survived to this day. Yes, today it is even the case that even many Christians, as well as people of no religion and other faiths, as Muslims get rid of their pubic hair, and therefore go along with it more cleanly than many others who are not so fond of general body hygiene.
That is of correctness.
Contact Report 260.
Muslims. Their calendar begins with the Hijra Samalmur departure, so with the emigration, that is to say flight, of the Prophet Muhammad aka Abul Qasim. Muhammad ibn Abd Allah, Samsak Muhammad, Arabic the Praised One, born in Mecca around AD 570, died in Medina in 632 AD. From Mecca to Medina, an event that took place on the 24th of September in AD 622. In the year 2000 they will, therefore, first reckon the year 1378, that is to say the year 1379 at the beginning of the third Christian millennium.
Contact Report 437.
It has to be said that jihad is completely misunderstood, because by this Muhammad meant something completely different than to wage war by force of arms. His real teaching, namely, was to the effect that by the jihad he understood the individual struggle of the human being against himself or herself in order to become a good, positive, virtuous and true, dignified and honorable human being. Thus, Muhammad's teaching of jihad is fundamentally to the effect that the human being shall not wage the holy war with deadly weapons and not against other human beings, but against himself or herself, in order to gain self-cognition and truth, so that he or she can truly live in humanity as a human being and fulfill the creational laws and recommendations. But this teaching of Muhammad has been thoroughly falsified, as well as wrongly interpreted, and indeed up to the present day. This has also been done with the teaching that the human being shall live rightly, well, positively and virtuously, as well as law-fulfillingly and recommendation-fulfillingly, in order to be an example in an instructive wise to the children and adolescents, as well as to adults of all ages, just as all the prophets taught, even if it was presented by them with other words. The fact that these parts of Muhammad's teaching, along with many others, were falsified, led to the fact that many aspects of his teaching also led to false explanations and to evil consequences, as this unfortunately still continues to have an effect today. in particular by the radical, terroristic Islamism of those confusingly led, who pass themselves off as Muslim men and Muslim women, but neither understand nor live the teaching of Islam. True Muslim males and Muslim females see and live Islam in a different and peaceful kind and wise, thus not in war and terror against those who believe differently of their own Islamic religion or other religions. True Muslim males and Muslim females are not extremist Islamists and therefore not terrorists, for they are in truth striving to be peaceful and true human beings in self-cognition, and also to live in peace and humaneness with those who are of another religion.
Those are good words.
There is, however, something more to say about this, namely, that it corresponds to a widespread misunderstanding that each Islamic war was a war of religion, and that it had always been the purpose of the war to forcibly and inevitably convert the defeated peoples to Islam with the sword. Of course, there were such wars of religion, but this only applies to the early fightings of Muhammad, in which he had to raise the sword perforce against Jewish and Meccan opponents of the Madanese community. Otherwise he would have been murdered with his followers. Surah 5 solely refers to this, in which the following was taught in the real original form by Muhammad. And when the forbidden months have passed, then resist your adversaries who serve tin gods, where you meet them, seize them, and besiege them, and lie in wait for them in their own ambush, to put them in captivity. But only deprive them of their lives when self-defense requires it. But if they repent, then put mercy before justice, let them pay the zakat tax for the poor, and give them the freedom that they can go their way. But since the falsification of this aphorism has found its entrance into Islam, it has been taught and also translated in the following form: and when the forbidden months have passed, then kill the servants of tin gods where you meet them, and seize them and besiege them, and lie in wait for them in every ambush. But if they repent, and if they do the prayer and pay the zakat tax for the poor, then grant them their way. Truly, Allah is all-forgiving, benevolent. Or another translation version: slay the servants of tin gods where you find them, but if they repent and do the prayer and pay the poor tax, then let them go their way. The truth is that neither in this nor in other teaching verses has Muhammad spoken thereof, that enemies should simply be beaten to death and killed, but he spoke about the fact that this may be the case only in actual self-defense. As at all times, when Muhammad's effective and true teaching was falsified, it is then further falsified by wannabe knowing scribblers, in which case insults of the prophets and untrue ragbag stories become the norm. In fact, it would be necessary, as with the Talmud Emmanuel, that Muhammad's teaching be post-written in accordance with how he actually brought his teaching. Of course, there have been fanatics since the year one and also since every beginning, as with Christianity and all religions, except Buddhism and Islam, who used Muhammad's teaching in a wrong and falsified wise for their claims for might, and actually tried to spread Islam with the sword, which is why this has also spread as knowledge worldwide, and unfortunately is not to be denied. But those acted in such a wise were not real Muslims, but perverted fanatics who utilized falsified teaching parts for their own benefit. So, if also I speak or talk or write about it, such as in the book Ein offenes Wort, an open word, in German only, that facts are to be quoted in the teaching of Islam, which are connected with war, the sword, murder and manslaughter, etc., then it exclusively concerns facts that have arisen due to the falsification of the Quran, and which have nothing to do with the effective truth and reality, because Muhammad had not brought a teaching of war and murder, but a teaching of love, of truth, freedom, harmony, and of peace for all human beings on the earth, and indeed irrespective whatsoever of what race, religion, other belief orientations, or which people and which social status they belong to. He did so in the same wise as all the prophets of his line before him and after him.
Contact Report 453.
The name Muhammad or Muhammad, does it also have a female form? I am actually not aware of this.
The name also exists with us, whereby the female version is Muhammada or Mohammeda. Both forms are frequently used with us. The meaning is the one who is praised. Birth year A, D, period, 571 A, D. 19 February, 571, Warn died, A, D, period, 632, AD 10 point, 58 HRs, 8 June, 632 at 10:58 A. M.
On this list from Christian, various name meanings are still missing, as well as what became of Ishwish Gospod aka Allah. So we'll add to the whole thing if you, Ptah, can still tell me. So how old did Gospod get, if you know? And from when to when did he have contact with Muhammad? And why did he call himself Allah?
This is actually all known to me. He lived to be 1230 years old. He made contact with Muhammad when he was 3 years old on the 6th of May, 574 AD. The contact lasted until 8th of June, 632 AD, when Muhammad died. The name Allah was given to Gospod simply because it is the Arabic meaning for God.
Muhammad or Muhammad was actually called Abul Qasim Muhammad ibn Abdullah, but in his circles he was called Muhammad Abdullah or Muhammad Abdullah.
This is correct, but it is not common knowledge.
Contact Report 503.
Now as for the Prophet Muhammad, respectively Abdul Qasim Muhammad ibn Abdullah, as his correct name was, his lineage did not trace back to your lineage, because Muhammad's birth and life took place outside your lineage, as was also the case with the prophets Enoch, Elijah, Isaiah, and Jeremiah, who all came from various other lineage outside the lineage. So, apart from Emmanuel and you, the remaining 5 prophets of the Nakademion line each descend from 5 other family trees, which do not trace back to Semjasa, the father of Adam's procreation.
Contact Report 568.
With regard to circumcision and the circumcision ceremony in Islam, the following is to be said. According to the information of the Playaran, the Prophet Muhammad was born with a normal foreskin and not without it, as an invented story would like to portray it differently. In the Islamic religious book Quran alone, there is nothing to be found that calls for circumcision, because the true Prophet Muhammad never ordered such nonsense. Objectively speaking, therefore, the Quran does not allow for the circumcision of women or men, girls or boys, but this is of course of no interest to those who advocate this bloody trade, and therefore irrelevant. It is a fact that certain Islamic clergy who are fanatical about circumcision in various regions and countries are of the opinion that Allah has allegedly demanded this purification, and that the Prophet has also made this known, which is, however, in truth absolute nonsense. Muhammad, in fact, never spoke out in favor of male or female genital mutilation, but against it, because he knew it was wrong and that it was carried out among the Jews and even further outside his sphere of influence, as well as among his people themselves who had adopted the circumcision tradition from Judaism.
Contact Report 636.
The Quran, however, is not based on the effective message of the Prophet Muhammad, but largely unearth human falsifications of doctrine, points of view, and false laws, etc., which were gathered together and cobbled together long after Muhammad's death, and which have very little or nothing to do with Muhammad's doctrine, which unfortunately is not generally known to Islam believers. In fact, they do not know that what Muhammad taught is the teaching of truth, the teaching of the Spirit, the teaching of life.
Contact Report 701.
Emmanuel, as well as Muhammad, did not preach punishment or war, let alone wage it, as is claimed, for example, with regard to Muhammad, whose entire life story was falsified many times more than that of Emmanuel. With Muhammad there was no Sharia, no compulsory headscarf, no child marriage, no covering of the face, and many other things, as was invented long after his death, and books of lies were written from it. The teaching of Emmanuel and Muhammad was the one and only teaching of the prophets. The Spirit teaching, which was given as teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life, and which also exists today in a whole series of books, whereby the two works and Cup of Truth were both taught by Emmanuel and Muhammad, but were neither understood nor lived by the people of those times. On the contrary, the entire teachings were profoundly falsified, and so straightened out that murderous delusions arose, which could not be reconciled with the teachings or only in small parts, and caused enormous suffering, hardship, misery, wars, persecutions, deaths, murders, and destruction. One only has to think of the early and later persecutions and murders of Christians, as well as war campaigns, etc., as well as the Inquisition and other murderous events in the name of Christianity, and equally of the tremendous atrocities that were carried out unlawfully, mendaciously, and criminally in the name of Muhammad and his teachings. And this happened and still happens today, although neither Emmanuel nor Muhammad ever taught in this way, but, like all prophets before them, consistently adhered honorably and worthily to the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life, and did not misteach anything about domination, lust for power, inhuman punishment or capital punishment, child marriage, mummery, war, conquest, torture, human trafficking and the like or other nonsense, imbecility and other time-honored inhumanities.
Contact Report 703.
But now I would like to talk a little bit in detail and openly about how basically the so-called holy books came into being with regard to Christianity and Islam. Because the truth is that neither Emmanuel alias Jesus nor Muhammad themselves made any written records of the teachings of the prophets. Only Emmanuel's disciple Judas Iscariot, not Judas Iscariot or Iscarioth, knew the scriptures, while all the other disciples, contrary to all the conventional lies and claims, were just as ignorant of the scriptures as the followers around Muhammad. And just as the Torah, the Bible and the New Testament came about, so it was also with the Quran, which was never written after the teachings of Muhammad, but very long after his death by human beings who had neither seen the prophet himself, nor heard his teachings, nor known him themselves. Also with Muhammad it was in truth the case that no written records of his life and teachings were made during his lifetime, but such records only came into being long decades after his death, with tremendous mendacious claims, tall tales, and false doctrines being set up, which in no way corresponded to the truth regarding the reality of Muhammad's teachings and life. Everything about his personality, his behavior, and the doctrine of the prophets that he brought and taught was so thoroughly falsified and made into a religion that brings death and destruction to this day. The entire life story concerning Muhammad and his work has been so maliciously falsified that hardly a word corresponds to the effective reality. Muhammad neither taught nor waged wars, and those that were carried out in his name were against his will and the work of war-obsessed delusional believers who, on the one hand, misunderstood the teachings, reinterpreted them themselves, and thus falsified them. On the other hand, they used their doctrine-distorting and doctrine-ballooning for them useful, doctrine-twisting and doctrine-manipulating, deliberately fallish interpretations to further their warmongering and to be able to attribute the whole thing to the teaching and meaning of Muhammad. So they used their doctrine-distorting interpretations for their warmongering favors and advantages, completely contrary to the teachings of Muhammad, who taught neither hatred, capital punishment and child marriage, nor Sharia and such nonsense, hostilities to life and inhumanities. Lying and deceitful, as it has always been since time immemorial, and the whole thing has been preserved up to the present day, it was also easy for all those who invented his life story and devalued, disfigured, distorted and twisted it in such a way in relation to Muhammad to falsify everything in a slanderous way, that only a short time later it was no longer possible to verify anything. And today it is no longer possible at all. Because the effective truth about the person of Muhammad, his way of life, his teachings and his behavior in terms of morals, Ethics and customs as well as his worldly conduct can no longer be verified today, precisely because of the old mendacious records and false chronological annals. The delusion of lies and slander surrounding his personality, teachings, and behavior, etc., can no longer be eradicated. On the contrary, with regard to all the stories of lies and slander around Muhammad and his teachings, everything has become so ingrained in the Islamophobes and also in the Islam believers themselves that the effective truth is no longer accepted, but is reviled as lies and conspiracy theories. So it is also not accepted that the teaching of the prophets, or the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life, as it was already brought by Emmanuel and all 4 other prophets or heralds, Enoch, Elijah, Isaiah, and Jeremiah, which is now also taught today for the last time and spread by the Figu, is a teaching of the creative natural laws. A teaching that teaches the human being to live with all fellow human beings and all peoples in peace, freedom, and justice, in humanity and love. And this ancient teaching, whose origins can be traced back to Nocedemion, the universal herald who existed 9 billion years ago, also teaches that self-knowledge, consciousness, self-development, good self-esteem, empathy, and healthy self-respect, etc., are of the greatest importance for the individual human being, as well as connectedness with the existence of the entire environment. The fact is, however, that with regard to Muhammad and his teachings of the prophets, unfortunately, all evil was included in the once created falsifications by delusionists, those who were greedy for power, murder and war and other delusional elements, starting with murder and manslaughter, human trafficking, child abuse, war, exploitation, torture, and capital punishment, up to and including many other evils and human degradations. And out of this came religious wars and conquests in the name of faith and the ruler of heaven, etc. Child abuse was also commonplace long before the time of Muhammad the Annunciator, as was also the case with the ancient Hebrews, about which, however, silence is deliberately kept. Muhammad had denounced this through his teachings, but never succeeded in having his request for a ban on child marriage respected, even to this day. On the contrary, this part of his teaching was also falsified and denied ad infinitum, and it was even maliciously imputed to him that he himself had at least entered into a child marriage, which was later allegedly confirmed by his wife in this regard, but which was never actually the case. In truth, this child marriage lie was already rampant very early on in the first slanderous oral and then also in the first written traditions, which then also found its way into the invented and falsified life story of the prophet or annunciation, and has been preserved up to the present day. But the whole life story of Muhammad and the teachings of the prophets he brought were thoroughly distorted beyond recognition and turned into a false doctrine for hatred, war, death, subjugation, ruin, and destruction. Muhammad and Emmanuel, however, were in reality humble human beings of love, peace, freedom, justice, equality, and humanity, as were also the other, earlier and predetermined prophets Enoch, Elijah, Isaiah, Jeremiah from the same prophetic line before them. And, as I said, the old 4 prophets were predestined from time immemorial, as were Emmanuel and Muhammad, because they were prophets born of earth mothers from the nations, and therefore not sons of God, not chosen by a God and not servants of God, or such nonsense as was attributed to them in the course of time by crazy and delusional people. Enoch, Eliah, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Emmanuel and Muhammad were predetermined prophets or heralds of the doctrine of the prophets, or the doctrine of truth, doctrine of the Spirit, doctrine of life, which was created ages ago by the ever-first prophet or herald Nocedemion according to the creative natural laws, and carried on in his spiritual lineage, reincarnating over all times.
Contact Report 713.
In the time of the Prophet Muhammad, women wore headscarves, and many still do today. And this was also the case for many Christian women in Europe, particularly among the working-class population, well into the mid-20th century. Some passages in the Quran refer to the headscarf requirement, for example in verse 24:31. However, not all Muslim women see wearing a headscarf as a requirement of their religion.
Contact Report 721.
Muhammad born 19th February 571 632. After Emmanuel A.D. in the case of Muhammad, for example, it was more than 100 years after his death before the first words were written about him, and his teaching was completely disregarded and rewritten and replaced by a completely reinvented one. Hence, the true teaching that Muhammad brought, the teaching of the prophets, that is to say, teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life was not simply falsified beyond recognition, but it was, as was already the case with the same teaching of Emmanuel, completely denied and replaced by a new truth-falsified religious history that was fantasized together from the ground up and directed towards a Godhead and spread. In addition, over the course of centuries, new rules, rituals, prayer, behavior, and other regulations, as well as religious laws, etc., were invented over and over again, which were consciencelessly fantasized into the irrationally and confusingly invented senseless religious teaching and were mendaciously ascribed to the proclaimers Emmanuel and Muhammad. After Emmanuel's flight from Jerusalem, his entire life history from birth up to his death was spread and later also written down with monstrous falsifications, lies, assertions, and calumnies. Thus the same happened with Muhammad, whose real name indeed was Abdul Qasim Muhammad ibn Abdallah. If one has a close look at the life history of Muhammad, then it must also be said concerning this, that there is hardly a true word in all that which is supposedly handed down about him. For just as with Emmanuel, all around no one was knowledgeable in writing and written language, except his first wife, the widow Khadijah. She was a member of the highly respected Quraysh tribe and heiress of a caravanserai and a trading business in Mecca. At first, under her matriarchy, Muhammad did various works for her before they got together and married, after which she appointed him as a business partner. The woman was connected to Muhammad by sincere love and was also able to connect with his teaching, which she held in high regard, although she did not record a single word of his teaching or of his life in writing. The incredibly infamous calumny that Muhammad is said to have fathered several children with this woman corresponds to a lie beyond compare, because the woman was incapable of conception and therefore could not be impregnated by Muhammad. However, since Khadijah wanted to have children, it was decided in agreement between her and Muhammad to adopt several orphans and to secretly pretend that they were their own. After his wife died, he married Sauda bint Zama as his second wife, with whom, however, he also did not father any descendants, nor with Aisha bint Abi Bakr, who was his third wife, and who, contrary to the slanderous traditions, was neither 6 nor 7 or 9 years old at the time of marriage, but 19 years of age. And the malicious story of slander against her, which is said to have arisen during the campaign against the Banu el-Mustalik in the year 627, is just as much a malicious lie as is the story of the 12 mothers of the believers, which was built up on nothing more than lies and deception. This applies equally to the many lies that Muhammad, in addition to his regular marriage, married a greater number of women and had slaves as concubines. For in fact it was only the 3 wives Khadijah, Sauda bint Zama and Aisha bint Abi Bakr, whom he had married after the death of Khadijah, and also these marital bonds remained childless, because even with these 2 women, he was not of the sense to procreate offspring. All the larger numbers of other women who were around him, were in no way in any marital connection with him, nor in any kind of relationship of a slavish or concubine-like nature. Rather, they were all well protected in his care and friendship. So, long after his death, other women were imputed to him by lies and calumnies of alleged relatives and chroniclers and so forth, and had no truth content whatsoever. This also applies to the veiling of women, as well as to completely different senselessnesses. Maliciously minded ones who were against the spreading of the early wrong Christianity that had emerged centuries earlier, through which the true teaching of the proclaimer Emmanuel was completely falsified, saw in it an opportunity to falsify the teaching of Mohammed as well. So, in his time, they seized the opportunity to falsify his teaching, which was indeed the same as that of Emmanuel, and to spread rules and regulations, just as it was with regard to the teaching of Emmanuel. Just as Emmanuel was not able to defend himself against it, so it also happened with Muhammad, because when both had gone their last way, their ever-identical teaching was abysmally falsified, and new religions were created from it. As a consequence, the believers turned to the new teachings, to which Muhammad and Emmanuel could no longer oppose because of their departure. Hence Christianity with the New Testament and Islam with the recitation, that is to say, the Koran, completely suppressed the truthful teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life. Ancient Palestine was occupied by the Romans at the time of Emmanuel and had experienced some increase in prosperity under them, even though the native population was directed by a harsh Jewish and religious-oriented rule, which is why it was opportune for the emerging Christians to devise a story of lies of a resurrection of the crucified Emmanuel and to call him Jesus. This, while southern Arabia was a very backward area at the time of Muhammad, far away from all the cultural and economic centers of the world at that time, where the human beings who were poor suffered great hardship and were only too happy to believe in and fall prey to a new religion of salvation. If the old scrolls writings are examined, which are supposed to come from disciples, direct followers and the like, as well as from direct or indirect descendants, relatives or from family members of the two proclaimers, then all such alleged written proofs correspond altogether to only sneaky and disingenuous falsifications, wrong memories only partly true, and wrong renditions as well as very fallible interpretations by the scribes. Truthfully, there is not a single such ancient document which would be directly or semi-directly related to a person who had been in direct or indirect contact with Emmanuel or Muhammad. Claims to the contrary and so-called written documentary evidence proofs correspond to nothing other than falsifications and lies, because in the case of both Emmanuel as well as Muhammad, the first written records were made only years later, after their departure, that is to say, after their death. And this happened according to very inadequate or erroneous memories, but also through conscious false claims and lies, etc., as a result of which glorifications and fairy tales regarding Emmanuel and Muhammad also came about. In addition, various direct and indirect followers were fraudulently, lyingly attributed to the two proclaimers, who in truth, however, had nothing to do with them. Even disciples, followers and relatives as well as friends, etc., versed in writing, were attributed to the two proclaimers Emmanuel and Muhammad at all times, but out of all those mentioned, not a single one was knowledgeable of the script and writing. Judas Iscariot was the only one amongst all who correctly and truthfully mastered the script and who was well versed in writing and a disciple close to Emmanuel. Later, he was slandered by falsifiers of writings and by hangers-on, just as the name of Jesus was then also imputed to Emmanuel. This, while all other records concerning the teaching of Emmanuel and Muhammad were in no way made by any of their disciples or direct or indirect descendants, etc., but by strangers, namely even only a long time after their death. Truthfully, however, in relation to the two of them and their teaching, which on both sides was the teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life, everything was abysmally misunderstood and boundlessly falsified beyond recognition. This also applies to various other ancient and newly discovered old writings, which likewise do not lead back to any disciples during the lifetime of Emmanuel or to direct followers or relatives and so forth of Muhammad.
Contact Report 754.
Through Christianity and its missionary work, which is still carried out worldwide today, millions of human beings were murdered, just as even today Christian missionary work continues to claim victims among the missionaries and missionaries in the name of the Lord. The same happened with Islam, as well as with all other religions, sects, and religious communities, whereby nowadays especially the completely degenerated Islamism commits murder of people of other faiths and also of people of the same faith, as it is also done by cross-criminal Islamic laws, for example in Persia, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, etc. This, whereby these murderous lies are still being practiced today worldwide in the name of the Lord. This, whereas these murderous lying and punishing laws and all the murders, floggings, tortures, blindings, mutilations, and death sentences, etc., resulting from them are justified by the Sharia, and derive from it or from the totality of all religious and religious beliefs. The totality of all religious and unlegal norms, mechanisms for UN norm-finding and false interpretation regulations of Islam, and which are mendaciously and slanderously attributed to Muhammad because he is supposed to have taught them, which, however, corresponds to an impudent, disgraceful, and malicious lie-slander of conscienceless crime-like scribblers. The Holy Book of Islam is the Quran, which is said to contain revelations that Muhammad received from God and Allah, respectively, in 22 years from 610 and 632 AD. As has been customary from time immemorial, these statements were only written down decades and even more, after more than 100 years and more, as with the Bible and other holy scriptures, after Muhammad's death as traditions and repeated reinterpretations, ultimately with X times more additions, which Muhammad neither said nor misinterpreted, and written in 114 chapters or surahs. In the course of time, however, these traditions were more and more frequently embellished with what had supposedly happened, and fantasties were also invented, which were additionally embellished by constantly new additions to fairy tales, and persons were also beamed up to saintly figures, so that in the end the whole thing corresponded only to complete unreality. This is also what happened in the form of signs, stone writings, stone pictures, sculptures and writings, and which today is taken at face value by scientists and is no longer questioned, which not infrequently leads to scientifically proven assertions that do not correspond to real reality and truth, such as the lies, deceptions, and slander regarding the alleged and never-made statements and teachings of Emmanuel Jesus and Muhammad. This is exactly the same as is the case with Emmanuel Chur and Muhammad, whose teachings and work, etc., have been abysmally falsified in the course of time and already during their lifetime, as well as especially long after their death, and statements have been denied, fantasized, attributed to them in their mouths, and holy books have been made out of them, which are so full of ashen lies and slander that they cannot be surpassed by the greatest efforts. The greater part of all alleged traditions correspond in truth to unparalleled untruths, which, as Siddhartha himself expressed, correspond to an unpardonable shamefulness, just as Emmanuel Chur and Muhammad expressed themselves in a similar way about all that has been fabricated from their teachings by lies, falsifications, fraud, malice, misunderstanding, and fanaticism, etc., and has led to a delusional religion of God. In the end, it must also be said that I do not attack any old true prophet, teacher, or herald, such as Emmanuel, Buddha, Abram, Confucius, or Muhammad, etc., nor any founder of a religion or sect, either as a human being or in his honor and dignity, or as a person or in his personality. If I raise my voice attacking the founders of religions or sects, it is not directed against the human beings, their person or personality, but only against their wrong actions, deeds, and false teachings, and the spreading of their faith. Real prophets, teachers or heralds, such as Emmanuel lyingly called Jesus, Buddha, Abram, and Muhammad, whose true teachings have unfortunately been maliciously and slanderously falsified and refabricated into cult religions, are taboo and unassailable for me, just as I have also not attacked these true prophets, because all honor and dignity is due to them.
Contact Report 797.
This also remained the case when Islam and its faith arose later, which was actually a continuation of Christianity and was also supposed to lead back to the truth. However, this failed thoroughly because the human beings misunderstood the teachings from the very beginning and, contrary to Muhammad's teachings, adopted, worshipped, and began to worship the new God of the Christians, just as the Christians had been doing for several centuries. Only in Islam he was called Allah. The Prophet fought against this throughout his life, but all his efforts were unsuccessful. When he passed away, scribblers took up the pen and falsified the doctrine from the ground up in such a way that it became a religious misconception just like Christianity. Unfortunately, this created a boundless hatred against the Jewish believers for the reason that the Jewish priesthood had Emmanuel Billy, alias Jesus Christ, crucified with the permission and assistance of the Romans. Emmanuel was regarded by the new religious doctrine of Islam as Muhammad's preceding prophet, and as such he was practically untouchable. Unfortunately, Muhammad's doctrinal efforts were a complete failure, for the doctrine of effective reality and its truth, as with Christianity, became a confusion of beliefs and misconceptions among human beings, whereby the whole thing lost all rational control, which has remained so to this day. Thus, the Islam religion not only became a mite, but a delusion was created through which bloody wars arose, as well as special rites of worship of Allah, whereby special features were also included in the prayers. This belief inevitably led to torture and murder, as well as the rape of women and children, as has been the case with Christianity from the very beginning, and has been preserved, especially in Catholicism, up to the present day.
Contact Report 830.
Especially the young, inexperienced, uneducated, and stupid Foreign Minister Baerbock has such a big mouth, drooling with low intelligence, that it is heard in Persia by the religious fanatical dictators and arouses even more hatred in them, enjoining them to hang more human beings on ropes in the name of Allah, because they are obsessed with the delusion that this is the correct manner to defend the faith in Allah and His laws. But Muhammad did not say these Allah's laws, and never brought them, for he spoke of true love, but never of killing and of torture and murder, as he also tried to prevent wars shamefully instigated and waged in his name, etc., with which he never had anything to do, but which are slanderously attributed to him.